Okay, and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming along tonight to our webinar. We're going to be talking today about sensory impacts on classroom learning and the sensory parts that impact on learning to increase it, but sometimes decrease it, unfortunately. So let's just share the screen to get going. Okay. Can we see the screen there? Can we just have a quick yes from the comments, please, just to make sure? Can you see the share screen? Okay, let's get going. So, let's talk about the sensory piece. I'm just going to make sure this is sharing. Okay, so let's talk about the learning outcomes. So today we're going to be talking about having an understanding about the sensory piece. And we know what are our senses? How do we understand our environment, and especially in the classroom environment? How do we learn, and what can impact on our learning? We're going to look at a greater understanding of what sensory issues are in class and how to identify that. And we're going to identify behaviours or actions from children that are clues that there might be sensory difficulties happening in class. So, our teachers are one of the most privileged and respected professions. They are trusted with teaching our children and coaching our children, and not just with the 3 R's of reading, writing and arithmetic, but with the ever-growing demands for psychosocial programs. But teachers have an increasingly difficult role in teaching, and I think this has changed a lot over the last 20 or 30 years, or at least my parents-in-laws who are teachers, they report that things have changed a lot since they started their teaching professions. So now we have increases in behaviour difficulties, learning difficulties, diagnoses such as ASD, autism, ADHD, ODD, OCD, all the different letters. Some kids seem to have a couple of lines of diagnoses, unfortunately. Increasingly more mental health referrals, low self-esteem and depressive symptoms, referrals to inpatient units for kids who are 10, 11, 12 years old. It's really heartbreaking what's happening. With family breakdowns, kids not feeling, not knowing where they fit into the world, that can really impact on children's behaviour in classrooms as well. And then, of course, we have, the trauma, neglect, and abuse of too many children, which again is heartbreaking and really does impact on their ability to cope, but can also bring up lots of sensory issues that might be underlying there. And the list seems to be increasing, unfortunately. So, teachers at the tone of their classrooms, they can build that warm environment. So they have such an opportunity to be able to help children. So what about the prevalence of learning disabilities? So up to 10% of the population are affected by specific learning difficulties, such as dyslexia, dyscalculia and autism. And this can be 2 to 3 children in each class. So, 10% is quite high. And what happens is in preschool, about 3% seem to be diagnosed, and then between 5 and 11-year-olds, about 8%. And by the time they're in high school, about 9% of children are diagnosed with learning difficulties. So what is sensory processing? So it's the ability to be able to gather sensory information from our environment, to understand information, to organise it in our mind and organise it to know how we can use that information, and then to use the information in a practical way, in a functional way, to be able to do what we need to do. So what are our different senses? So we have vision, and there's so many visual things that are happening in the classroom. So we have, children moving around the room, which can be distracting. We have, visitors popping in to say hi and to pass on messages. There's people walking up and down the corridors. So There's lots of visual things that can be distracting for kids. So the muscle sense is one of those senses that we don't really think about. It's called a muscle sense or proprioception. It's linked to body awareness, to postural, core postural strength, and it's kind of like a kinesthesia sense. We have an auditory processing system, which in a classroom, the noise can often get too loud, so that can be distracting, or it can be overwhelming for some kids. Auditory processing difficulties can also impact on kids being able to understand and to process what the teacher is saying, and especially when there's other background noise, it can be really hard for the child to cue in and to be able to not just to hear, but also to really cue in and understand what the teacher is saying. We have the mouth sense, and we have all seen those kids who chew on their fingernails, who chew on their collars, or chew on their pencils. And sometimes these kids do this because they might be trying to wake themselves up and keep themselves alert enough to be able to cue in and listen. Or maybe they might be a bit anxious, and using the mouth can be a tool to help to calm them down and keep them organised. We have our movement sense, and we all know those kids. We see them really quickly who are always on the move, so that they might be very busy in class. They're always moving around. They can't stay in their seat, or they're rocking in their chair. Then we have our touch sense, and these are the kids who are fiddling and touching and using that to help to keep them awake and alert. And it could also be the child who doesn't like to touch different things. So the last one is our smell sense, and this might impact kids in the classroom if they notice, if they're oversensitive, they might notice your deodorant or perfume, and they might find that bothersome. But some children actually seek out different smells, and it helps to keep them alert and awake as well. Okay, so what's the prevalence of sensory issues? So research says between 5 and 16% of the population, so that's kids and adults, struggle with sensory processing difficulties. So again, this is about 1 to 4 kids in a classroom, and this may be the same kids who have the learning difficulties or have autism, but you can have sensory processing difficulties separate to diagnoses, as well as a part of other diagnoses. So sensory processing disorder is when the sensory signals, they don't get organised in the brain. They get miscommunicated from the time it's taken in through the touch sense or the hearing sense or the visual sense, for example, and they don't get organised, and this can disrupt what a child needs to do. So it can disrupt their coordination, and it can also disrupt their ability to self-regulate and to concentrate. So I was just interested when I was preparing for this, just to do some looking and to see how prepared teachers feel when they're meeting the needs of these children who need extra support for including students in their class. And I found this study by Brownell from 2006, and they were saying that general education teachers play a primary role in the education of students with disabilities, but they often report being unprepared to undertake the role. It's true not only for the general education teachers who are experiencing firsthand the changes that are occurring through the education system, but even for pre-service or experienced teachers who are completing their master's degrees, believe that they are still not learning the skills needed to successfully teach in today's classroom environment. So that was a real wake-up call to me, that and I guess we can see it when we enter some classrooms too, that there's the students who we're seeing these days, some of them are really, really struggling, and some kids are really, really on the edge, and so we really need a whole team approach with teachers as well as allied health and medical professionals to give the best chance to be able to support these children from different perspectives. So, yeah, when I visit classrooms, I meet with teachers of various levels as well. Some teachers are quite confident in their teaching, but they're very aware of their own personal learning needs, and they're open to support. Some teachers struggle with classroom management, and their coping style of using like a loud voice and trying to control the class verbally, it just doesn't work. Some teachers find it hard to be mindful, and they find it hard to be aware of their interactions with children, and how their classroom management strategies are working. And the common element is with all teachers that they are passionate about their students, and they want to do the very best for all their students, so that the students can get the best learning outcomes. And I was also interested in how parents of children with learning difficulties feel. And I found these stats that 35% of parents have serious concerns about their ability to cope with their children's learning issues. 31% have conflicting feelings. They accept their children's issues, but they're not sure how to find or ask for help. And they often feel really stressed, even if they're they feel stressed with their conflicting feelings, and they do admit to being impatient with their children, and they're really worried about their children's future. And the other third, about a third, are optimistic about their ability to cope. So about 2/3 of parents are really struggling with knowing how to help their child with learning difficulties, and I've had this experience too with one of my kids, and even as a professional, it's really hard to know sometimes, exactly what the right way to go is to help your child. So why should we bother with sensory issues? Well, because sensory issues are not just, kids who are picky eaters or kids who struggle with touching paint or glue. Sensory processing impacts on learning, impacts on concentration and engagement, impacts on anxiety, levels of distractibility, emotional regulation. So sensory is sometimes the missing piece of the puzzle, and it's sometimes not well known in some school settings about the research behind it or how to implement it. And sensory is not everything, but I think we need to consider it to give a really holistic view of what might be happening for a child. So here's some examples of sensory processing difficulties in class and at school that might be things that you're seeing in your class all the time. So that kids might struggle with sitting through a lesson. They might seem distracted. They might be disruptive in class. They can't pay attention to what the teacher's saying because they're distracted by different sensory information. They might be bumping into other kids in lines and getting into fights or squabbles when they're lining up. Often they find it hard to hold a pencil and they're pressing too hard or too soft. And handwriting is really hard, so their handwriting is often messy. They often have meltdowns in transitions during assemblies, and they often need to leave the hall or the room where the assembly is being held because they can't sit still for long enough, or the noise and the echoing of the hall might be too much for the nervous systems. They might have difficulties with transitions. And they might have fights on the playground, disrupting play. They often struggle with planning as well, with their motor planning and also planning of their actions. So that can be another big sign of sensory processing difficulties. So what happens in the nervous system when there are sensory issues? So there could be sensory registration difficulties. So these are receiving incorrect information from the environment. So not knowing, how hard to press with a pencil. Or it could be, not being able to know, how hard or how fast to throw the ball. And so if they throw the ball too hard, then it's not going to be, a really fun game of, catch and throw if they they can't coordinate that to make it happen for the other child and to be helpful. With the orienting response, this is being distracted by the smallest noise or noticing every time a student moves around the room or a visitor enters the room. So they're trying to focus on their work, but as soon as they have any distraction, they are orienting to that, and then they often find it hard to then orient back down and to remember to keep on going with what they need to do. With arousal, this is struggling to be at the just right level of alertness. So lots of kids are in a low level of arousal, so they might appear tired and they can't kind of wake up their nervous system to be in that just right range. Or they might be too busy in their body, or their thoughts might be racing too much, so they can't get in that just right zone for concentration. Attention. So struggling to notice and to cue into learning to be able to maintain attention on the task. So it's having that maintained attention and not being distracted. Self-regulation. So it's being able to control your emotions. So being able to handle when someone enters my personal space, for example, and not to react. Or, if I'm tired, being able to teach your child to be able to have, self-talk and strategies, sensory-based strategies, so they can hold it together and keep their emotions under control. Then there's the fight response, which is our stress response. And that's being aware of when a child, enters the stress response and being able to help to problem solve and to break down the task of what they need to do and to try and figure out, what's the trigger, why are they feeling overwhelmed or in this stress response. Is it a truly sensory reaction, or is it sensory-driven behaviour? Then we have overload and shutdown. So I have seen quite a few kids in the last 12 months who have been in an overload or shutdown response when I've come into the room, and this can be really frustrating and really almost scary for some teachers, because it's hard to know what to do to support them and to bring them out of it. So I came into a room once, and the teacher goes, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here," because I was there to see another child, but that didn't work out, so I just popped in. And this kid had been at their desks for about 20 minutes, and they were just sitting there with their hands, their head down on their desk, and they were in this shutdown response. And by doing some deep touch pressure and talking calmly, and I was able to bring them out of that, which was really helpful for the teacher. And then we went aside and we unpacked. I unpacked with the child, what was happening and what led her to enter that. Also, I've been in the class where a child has hopped in a cupboard of their own accord to try and get some squishing on their body and have some quiet away time, and then just working through with them in that situation, talking about how they feel and bringing them out so they can feel really safe, so that they can come back into the class, to even just to sit there and to listen and to take in some information without actually doing the pen and paper work. So the last one is defensiveness. So that's when we might be defensive, like a little bit of noise feels way too much, or a little bit of touching the glue or the paint or the messy things can be way too much to a child's sensory system. Okay, so there's another study here I want to talk about, which compared sensory processing of children with and without autism in the home and classroom environments. And this was fascinating. It highlighted, so they assessed the sensory profile in children with autism and children with typical development. They found that in the home environments, the home and classroom context, they compared, and they did find some differences in the main sensory systems that were impacted. In the home environment, hearing was the most affected and touch was the least effective. And in the classroom environment, touch and hearing were the most affected. So I'll put that link to the research into the notes when I send the recording out tomorrow for you. And from the study, they proposed that we should try to reduce unpredictable auditory and touch inputs at the classroom. So I guess giving notice, when the bell's about to ring, and giving a child who we know is over responsive to touch some notice that the art class is coming up, for example, and tell them what they're going to do so they can have some time to process what's coming up. Yeah, and also by talking about with your OT some strategies, and we're going to be getting into strategies in some webinars training in the next couple of months about what we can do in classrooms to be able to support the sensory systems, such as the touch system before they need to do messy play, for example. So there's another amazing research study which is really interesting. It's called Clever Classrooms, and it comes out of the University of Salford in Manchester in the UK, and it's came out in 2015, and I'll put the link to that report as well in the notes. And this Clever Classrooms report just confirms all the different strategies that OTs have been talking about for years. And they talk about, the clear evidence have been found that well-designed primary schools boost children's academic performance in reading, writing and maths. They talk about differences in the physical characteristics of classroom, explain a 16% of the variation in learning progress over a year. And the study was done with 3,766 pupils. And they found that by having, a better classroom environment set up, that, it increased learning by 16%, which is really massive. And they also found, surprisingly, that the whole school factors like the size, the navigation routes, the specialist facilities and the play facilities, they don't seem to be anywhere near as important as the design of the individual classrooms. So the power is to individual classroom teachers to be able to create, really creative environments that really support learning. And I guess the challenge is for OTs to be able to, to support you in doing that as well. So I just wanted to talk to you here about the different types of sensory processing that we have, and the different sensory responses. So this comes from a sensory model that I put together last year, and I'll show you the full one at the end of this workshop, and I'll include a copy of that as a freebie as well at the end. So I have to call it the seesaw of sensory processing. So the first section is the over-responsive kids. So this is where a little bit of sensory information feels way too much. So that over-responsive reaction might be passive. So this is where kids are really aware of their environment. They like to have control over their own space. They may have some meltdowns and freeze, and they might struggle. They kind of have that freeze response. So this would be that little girl I was talking to you about who kind of just froze in her seat and she couldn't move. She was so overwhelmed that she was in that freeze response. The other over-responsive reaction we can have is the active response. So that's where, a child might find it's way too noisy, so they might put their hands over their ears, which is a sign that that's way too much, of course, but then they actually can run away. So these might be the runners who remove themselves from the classroom, and we see that as a negative behaviour, but for them it's actually a coping strategy, which really works for them. So these kids like to have control of their environment. They're very particular about their needs. And if they do feel overwhelmed, they can take themselves away. So in different situations, the same child may freeze, or the same child may be able to take themselves away, depending on how big their sensory input might be, or what other stresses might have happened during the day. At the top of the seesaw, we have the sensory cravers. So these are the kids who are always on the go. They thrive on getting more sensory input. They're often the life of the party. They're heaps of fun to be around. But these kids, they don't know how fast they're going, and we need to teach them, using like a fast, slow, just right self-regulation meter, how to know, like, when they're going too fast. So giving that feedback of, Esther, I think that you're going too fast. How can we bring you down and make your body feel more calm and organised and relaxed? These kids are very busy in their bodies and busy in their minds, and they find it hard to concentrate and relax as well. So they can be sensory cravers for just one sense, or they can be sensory cravers for many senses. And again, it depends on the day. So for some days you might be over-responsive in one sense, but you might be seeking out sensory information from another sense. The other flip side of that is the child who's under-responsive. So these kids, they often don't notice things, or they need to have lots more sensory information to be able to notice that. So for these kids, the clothes might not sit right. They don't notice that their clothes are, skewed around and not tucked in, or, not hanging straight. They may not notice mess on their hands. They may not notice that their hands are dirty after, playing on the playground. They might find it hard to get started. They're sometimes tired and lethargic, and they need lots and lots more sensory information to kind of wake them up so they can be in that just right zone. And once these children who are under-responsive get that sensory information, they can move out of the lower arousal range into the just right range, and then they can really cue in and learn. But we often need to teach them strategies for getting that sensory input to be able to push them up so they can concentrate and learn. So let's look at some of the different senses and some examples of how we might pick that a sense may be involved with some classroom behaviour. So with the auditory sense, so we might be distracted by a student's discussion. We might be bothered by white noise of the fan, the heater, or the air conditioner. So if you have a fan on next to you, or if you can notice any other noise around you right now, sometimes children can be really distracted, or they can be bothered by that as well. Some children become overwhelmed when the bell goes, and they might put their hands over their ears, or they might have some kind of emotional reaction to show that they are distressed, or they don't like that sound. Sometimes it's too loud under the school collar, so they might withdraw to have some quiet space, and they might not feel comfortable in going to play and interact with kids in that situation because it's too loud from the echoing from the school collar. They might tap their pencil in class, or they might hum in class. And sometimes this can be a seeking activity, so they might be doing that. So they are making themselves more alert and waking themselves up. But sometimes it is a strategy to self-calm, or sometimes they're making the noise so they can have their own little noise sphere around them so that they can feel in control of the noise in their environment. With auditory processing, I mentioned auditory processing disorder before, and for children who have lots of kids working around them, as we do in lots of group work in classrooms, they might find it hard to be able to screen out that noise, to be able to focus on the teacher. So this might be an example of this is, if we were talking in a cafe and there was lots of noise around us, how we do screen that out. And, sometimes it can be really, really hard to focus on that. Children finding it hard to pay attention to what the teacher's saying, and often they have meltdowns. So, when someone is over responsive to any of the senses, they can go into that stress response, that fight, flight, fright response. And this can happen during transitions, during assemblies, and they might have to leave. So the visual sense. So here we can, when children might be bothered by the glare coming off the whiteboard from the window or the smart board, and sometimes that can be just hard to focus on, and sometimes it can actually hurt their eyes from that reflection. Being distracted by any hanging visuals with the crafts or the displays, like the paintings, posters that might be hung, in the classroom. That can sometimes be distracting to the concentration. Difficulty in knowing how to find visual information on the wall. So especially if there's like too many visuals or posters or routine charts or posters about phonics, these are all really important, but it's important to try and structure them so that they are visually easy on the eye, and grouping different posters together with a coloured background can be really helpful. Fluorescent lighting, that can be really distracting, but it can also, the flickering of the fluorescent lights, especially if the bulbs are getting a bit old, can be really tiring on the eyes, and can be really distracting for some kids. Sometimes some teachers, they don't put the lights on, they don't put fluorescent lights on because of that flickering, but sometimes it does get too dark to be able to concentrate, and sometimes if kids are struggling with their eyesight, then it can be hard for them to be able to focus and to do what they need to do, so that can be tiring as well. And the child who doesn't know where to start on the workbook. So if they have a page with 4 boxes of maths problems, sometimes a child with visual issues might need the box that they need to work on highlighted around that to kind of really bring out of the page that part of knowing where to start, or covering up the other parts of the page that they don't need to do, so they aren't distracting as well. Can be really helpful. So the muscle and proprioceptive sense. So we've spoken about, kids who press too hard or not hard enough because they don't get that muscle feedback about how they need to press down. Kids who have messy writing, kids who struggle with coordinating of their fingers. The child who pushes their chair or, closes the door way too hard. So they might, push their chair and it pushes the table forward. They just don't get that feedback in their arm muscles about, how much they need to push in. Kids who play roughly with other children, again, they don't get that muscle feedback through their muscle senses that of how hard and how much force they need to do with playing with kids. Kids who have poor posture at the desk or sitting on the floor, so we often work with kids to increase their core stability so they can have the strength to be able to stand up or sit up or to sit on the floor. And also offering alternate seating arrangements can be really helpful for kids to make it more comfortable for sitting for longer periods. Kids who have poor coordination or are clumsy, again, don't have that body awareness or coordination to be able to do what they need to do. And they often get picked on as well, which is not very helpful for their self-esteem. And then again, kids who bump into others in line, they don't judge the space between themselves and other kids. And if they do brush a child, they may not register at that quick enough. So they keep on moving along, which the other child may interpret as being, a punch or a hit. So that can be frustrating for the child. Okay, the touch sense. So, with kids, sitting on the floor during story time, they're often fiddling with pens, or fiddling with their clothing, or fiddling with their friends' clothing, and that can be distracting for some kids. So, some kids, they might need a fidget toy when they're sitting in group time to be able just to fidget away. And we do that as adults as well. Like in a meeting, we might, fiddle with a corner of the paper, or, doodle. And that's our sensory way of keeping alert and organised. Those kids who avoid messy play, so playing, so painting, play and art. Those kids who, they struggle with meltdowns in transitions during assemblies, and needing to leave as well. So we have the movement sense. So these are the kids who are always on the go. They find it hard to walk together, like in their class lines, because they might want to go too fast, or they might be dawdling behind. These kids, they are always getting up and walking around the room because they need to have that movement input to be able to feed their nervous system. They often bump their tools, like their ruler or their pencil, off their desk, so they have to tip over and pick them up. So each time they tip their head over and they pick it up, they get some more movement input through their ears when they turn their head upside down. And again, that can feed their sensory system and keep them much more alert. Kids, who have movement issues can seem distracted. They struggle to sit through a lesson. They rock on their chair and they get in trouble for that. They don't like PE or sport often because, some kids don't like PE or sport because they don't like to move. So the movement sense is those kids who are seeking, but there's some kids who they don't like to move. So as preschoolers, they probably didn't like to sit on a swing because they like to have their feet on the ground. So these kids, they prefer to be stationed, they prefer to sit and to read, and they're very happy to sit on the sidelines and to watch. So the last sense here is the mouth sense, and again, we've got, kids who chew on their collar, they chew on their pencils. They might put too much food in their mouth at lunchtime. They may not notice that their mouth is full. So it's those kids who have, too much sandwich, when they have the marshmallow look, and they food often falls out as well. They may not notice that either. So the mouth is a really great tool for self-regulation. So sometimes kids do this to calm themselves down if they're feeling anxious, or if they're feeling tired and they're trying to keep in that just right zone. It can help to bring them up as well. So here we have the rest of the model, the seesaw of sensory processing, which is the model that I put together. So we have in the middle the different types of self-regulation like we've gone through previously. And I just want to mention the rings that go around the different, around the centre bit. So the first level is, levels of stress, anxiety, self-confidence and emotional capacity. So we need to really notice as adults who are helping these kids, you need to notice, what is a child's stress level? Can we notice any of the particular senses that might be contributing to stress or anxiety? Or if they are having like behaviour issues or emotional issues, are there any sensory issues that have been triggered for that? And one way of thinking about that is not just talking about what's the behaviour, but what is the behaviour a sensory-driven behaviour? And then we have other ways to support kids is through cognitive supports. So teaching kids about self-talk, teaching kids about problem solving, and teaching kids about breaking down the task so it doesn't seem so overwhelming. So, for example, if a child is worried about how to talk to a friend, we might break that down into different steps that they can practice in how to choose a friend, how to go over to that friend, how to say hello, how to turn or orient their body to face the friend, what kind of voice to use. Is it like an inside voice or a louder voice? And just really breaking it down into steps so they can learn one part of that task at a time. The third ring, the aqua ring, is the relationship supports at home, school and community. So others helping to structure that, the cognitive supports as well. And the last one, the purple ring and the whole outside, which I think just really holds the whole system together, is the physical environment supports. So the classroom and the home environments. So looking at, like we've spoken about, the noise, the visual environment, and structuring some retreat areas so that children can be supported. So having retreat areas in the classroom as well as at home. So wherever a child is, they can be taught of, you know, where they can go to feel safe, sensory safe. I really love this quote from Clever Classrooms, where it talks about a positive find from their research was that teachers can readily action many of the factors. The suggestions included, they are very small changes often. They cost very little or nothing, but they can make a massive difference. And I've been saying this for years, and it was so great to hear this from a research study, because, you know, just by changing the layout of the room, the choices of display or colour of the walls can make a massive difference. So I'll send you the link for that, because that's a really, really great resource to have a look through, and it kind of underpins and feeds into the different resources that we've got available to help you guys in structuring, to look at classroom environments from the sensory perspective. So one great resource is a school environment sensory checklist, and that's a checklist and a quick overview of looking at what are the different sensory areas, the different sensory systems, and what's that look like in a classroom environment. And then it has a checklist, a 5-page checklist that you can just go through and just look at the different sensory areas in the classroom and start to make some changes as well. So that's just a little quick look of part of it, the visual system. So as you can see, it's just really simple. It's looking at just specific parts of the classroom environment to make some small changes for big differences. The other exciting resource we have, which is just being transposed to a new platform, which is going to be released any day soon again, is the 20-day classroom detox. So it's a 20-day program for going through, looking at the sensory environment in the classroom. And we're so excited because completing the 20-day classroom detox contributes to 10 hours of NESA registered PD for teachers. So it's approved by the New South Wales Education Standards Authority, which is so fantastic to support teachers and also occupational therapists and other professionals who are really interested in making changes in the classrooms for these kids. So I will send out to you the free access to the CSIRO sensory processing, that ring model, the Sensory Strong Classrooms book, which is available free on our site, but I'll send you the direct link, and I'll send out the slide deck from the webinar today, so you can add that to your resource library, as well as some other links to some extra things as well. So just going to